Okay, so we built a model using database first workflow. Now let's take a look at the connection string to the database. So we open app.config. If you're building a web application, the configuration file is going to be web.config. Now here, take a look under connection strings. You see we have an item here called Pluto DB context. And note the connection string. Let me scroll to the right. So we have this section called metadata that includes 3 resources. So here is one resource. And note the vertical line, that's the separator. Here is another resource. Again, we have a separator. And here is another resource. So this whole part is our metadata that I will explain in a second. Now let's scroll to the right again. So after the metadata part, then we see this connection string part here. And here is the actual connection string to the database. So data source represents the SQL Server instance we're using. In this case, I'm using SQL Express. Initial catalog represents the name of the database, which is Pluto. And integrated security equals true means we're using Windows authentication to access the SQL Server. Sometimes your SQL Server has its own authentication mechanism, so you need to supply a SQL Server username password here. Now, one thing that I personally don't like about database first connection strings is that extra noise we have at the beginning of the connection string. I'm talking about this metadata part. This is too noisy for my personal taste. Later in the next section, when we get to code first models, you will see that we don't have this metadata with code first models. So you might ask, what is this metadata part then? Remember the XML from the last lecture? The XML behind an entity data model includes 3 parts: conceptual model, storage model, and mapping between the two. When we compile our application, Visual Studio takes that XML, breaks it into 3 parts, and stores them as embedded resources in our assembly. So back here, this metadata references the resources in our assembly that represent our conceptual model, our storage model, and the mapping between the two. So Pluto model.csdl is the conceptual model. Pluto model.ssdl represents the storage model, and Pluto model.msl is the mapping between the two. So these are resources that are embedded in the assembly. Now, the reality is you never have to open up an assembly and look at these resources. I just thought to explain this, so in case you come across a connection string that has this metadata, you know what this is all about.